A man fell from his horse into a snowstorm, bleeding and half dead, right outside a widow's cabin on the Dakota plains. She should have shut the door, should have protected her children, and let the storm finish what it started. But she didn't. She dragged him inside, stitched his wounds with trembling hands, and unknowingly set off a chain of mercy that would echo for generations. What began as a single act of kindness turned into a legacy of love, belonging, and a town that learned to stay because she chose to open the door. The wind had been screaming across the plains for 3 days by the time Josie Thatcher saw the man fall off his horse. She was hauling firewood toward the cabin, shoulders hunched against the gusts, when she caught the shape. A dark, slumped figure slipping down off a gray mare, the animal wild-eyed, its breath fogging thick in the cold. The man hit the snow without a sound, like a dropped sack of grain. He didn't move. Josie stood for a second, stunned, the rope of firewood trailing from her raw hands, and stared at the body sprawled 20 paces from her front steps. The snow fell so hard it blurred the line between sky and ground. She should have gone back inside, should have bolted the door, should have told herself it wasn't her problem. But her son Isaac was watching from the window, his 6-year-old face pale behind the frost-laced glass. And in the corner of her mind, Josie heard her husband's voice again, soft and already fading after a year in the ground, saying, "We don't turn away the broken, Joe." So she went to him. The man was barely breathing. His coat was fine, rich wool, expensive buttons, but soaked through with snow and blood. His gloves were gone, his lips split and blue. Josie dropped to her knees and rolled him onto his side. His eyes fluttered, unfocused. His mouth opened, trying to speak. "Don't talk," she muttered. "You'll freeze before you finish." He didn't argue. With strength she didn't know she had left, she dragged him through the snow to her door, kicked it open with her heel, and called, "Maggie! Isaac! Blanket! Now!" Her daughter appeared, eyes wide, holding the tattered quilt from the cot. Isaac ran to stoke the fire without being told. Josie lay the man down near the hearth, stripped off his frozen coat, pulled his boots. She worked his shirt open and hissed through her teeth. Blood seeped from a gash along his ribs, the skin pale and slick with ice. "I need the whiskey," she said. Maggie brought it. Josie poured it over the wound. The man flinched but didn't wake. She sewed the gash closed with shaking fingers, her hands going numb from effort. When it was done, she wrapped him tight in every warm thing they owned and leaned close to check his breath, faint but there. She sat back on her heels, panting. "Is he going to die?" Maggie whispered. Josie didn't look away from the man's face. "Not tonight." He didn't speak for 2 more days. He slept, burned with fever, muttered things she didn't understand, names maybe, places. Once he said, "Contracts," and once, "Don't sign it, Henry," and once, clearer than the rest, "I didn't want to leave her." When he finally woke, Josie was sitting by the fire patching Isaac's coat. He blinked up at the rafters, tried to sit. "Lie back," as she said without turning. "You tore something clean open on your left side. Took me 9 stitches and half my good thread to sew it shut." He settled slowly. His throat moved. "Where am I?" "Homestead." She looked at him. 10 miles west of what's left of Never Spring. His brows drew together. "That's Dakota territory." "It is." He closed his eyes again. Josie finished her stitches. "I found you in the snow, half dead. You owe your life to my 6-year-old boy who saw your horse first." The man's voice was quiet, dry as the wind. "Then I owe him everything." "You owe me my quilt," she said. He smiled. "Just barely." Later she asked his name. He hesitated, then said, "Daniel." "Daniel what?" He hesitated again. "Just Daniel," he said. Josie narrowed her eyes, but let it be. Daniel recovered slowly. Each day he moved a little more, spoke a little clearer. She caught him watching the children with something unreadable in his face. when Isaac played with the whittled horse Josie's husband had carved, when Maggie sat at the table copying letters from the back of a seed packet. He ate what they had, hardtack, stewed beans, what little meat Josie could trade for when the storm eased. Once, when she offered him her portion, he shook his head. "I've had enough taken from you." She arched a brow. "You remember that." He started chopping wood a few days later. She tried to stop him, but he shook her off. "I need to move." "You'll tear your stitches." "Then sew me up again." He wasn't strong yet, but he was determined. He split logs in slow, careful swings, taught Isaac how to stack them, repaired a shutter Josie had long given up on. When she asked what he did before, he said nothing, just stared into the fire. But Maggie found the papers first. They were in a waterproof pouch tucked deep in his saddlebag. Contracts, ledgers, letters with a seal she didn't recognize. She showed them to Josie one night after Daniel had gone to sleep. Josie read in silence, then said, "Daniel Everett." Maggie frowned. "Is that bad?" Josie looked down at the signature. "He's not just Daniel," she said. "He owns half the rail west of the river." In the morning, she didn't say anything. She made breakfast, gave Daniel his plate, watched him eat. He saw her look and said quietly, "So you know." She nodded. "I wasn't lying," he said. I wanted to stay alive first." She crossed her arms. "Railmen don't usually bleed in the snow without guards." He looked into his cup. "Board vote? I didn't agree. Someone wanted me gone." Josie sat. "Are they looking for you?" "Maybe, maybe not." "What do you want from me?" "Nothing," he said. "But if you'll let me stay until I can ride again, I'll fix your roof, fix that barn door. I saw the hinge yesterday. It won't last another wind." She stared at him, then nodded. 2 weeks. He stayed for 2 months. And by the time spring thawed the ground, Josie's world had started to change. Daniel never left. Not really. He said he would, more than once. Sat on the edge of the porch with his saddlebags at his feet, boots laced tight, eyes on the road. But each time, something stopped him. The sight of Isaac helping Maggie draw water from the well, the sound of Josie's voice calling them in for supper, the hush of the plains at dusk, soft and wide and honest. It was never one thing. It was all of it. Josie didn't ask him to stay, and she didn't have to. The morning the first rail crew came over the rise, Daniel was inside mending the table leg. Josie stepped out onto the porch, a hand over her brow. There were 5 of them, dusty and rough-looking, pulling a supply cart behind 2 mules. One man dismounted, took off his hat. "Ma'am," he said, "we were told to find Daniel Everett." She didn't speak. Daniel stepped out behind her, wiped his hands on a rag, looked at the man for a long moment. "I said not to come until spring." The man shifted, uneasy. "Wasn't sure if you were still—" "I'm still." They left supplies, spoke in low tones with Daniel. Said something about right-of-way and new track and a depot 3 counties east. He listened, nodded, told them to wait for his word. Then they left. Josie waited until they were gone. He stood at the porch rail, eyes far away. "Tell me," she said. He did. Not all of it, not right away, but enough. He'd built the rail company from nothing, surveyed land with his own hands, laid the first spikes when he was 20 and hadn't stopped since. He believed in steel, in speed, in bridges over rivers and tunnels through mountains. He'd built something vast and powerful, and it had nearly killed him, because men who saw only profit saw him as a problem, because he'd refused to cut corners, refused to throw towns aside like trash when the track moved forward. "I told them we'd build through," he said, "that we'd build with the land, with the people, not through them. And they tried to kill you for it. They tried to make me disappear." Josie watched him. "So why'd you come this way?" "I was supposed to ride east. But the storm came." He looked at her. "And then you did." She didn't look away. He didn't either. From then on, the work changed. Not just the chopping and mending and feeding the chickens. The big work began. Daniel wrote letters, drew maps, spoke with men in suits who came on horseback and stayed for supper. He offered land, offered roots, offered opportunity, not for his gain, but for the homesteads near Josie's, the ones starving, fading, forgotten. He started with the schoolhouse. It had been empty since the last teacher left 3 years earlier. He rebuilt the roof, brought in desks, hired a widow from back east who'd taught in Baltimore and wanted air in her lungs again. Next came the store. He paid for lumber, recruited a merchant who'd lost his shop in the fire up north, helped him haul crates in himself. A church, a blacksmith, a grain mill. Slowly, steadily, the prairie began to breathe again. And Josie watched, quiet, steady, certain. She helped, always, fed the men, nursed the sick, brought bread to the widowed woman 2 hills over whose boy was too young to ride yet. One night as they stood outside watching the lights of the new town flicker through the dark like stars made of wood and will, Daniel said, "You saved my life." Josie didn't answer. "You gave me something I didn't think I'd get again," he said. "A second beginning." Still she said nothing. He turned to her. "Josie." "I didn't do it for you," she said. He blinked. "I did it because my boy was watching, because my daughter was tired, because my husband believed in kindness, and I had to believe in something after he was gone." He nodded slowly, then said, "I love you for all of that." And she kissed him. No fanfare, no fireworks, just 2 people who had weathered storms the world would never see. He never left after that. They married in the cabin, with Maggie holding the flowers and Isaac standing tall beside Daniel like a soldier. People came from the hills, from the edges of the new town, from as far as the post office stretch could carry news. They didn't bring gifts. They brought hands, brought stories, brought hope. And Josie, who had once shivered alone in the dark with nothing but her children's breath and a rifle for comfort, stood in a room full of light and laughter and thought, This is what staying means. Years passed. The town grew. The trains came. Children learned to read. Mothers learned they didn't have to run. And Josie Thatcher, once a widow on a dying patch of land, became the woman people pointed to when they said, "That's how it started." Daniel built more. He built with her. He built for her. Not rail, not steel, but a life. A wide, warm, rooted life. And the children thrived. Isaac became a surveyor. Maggie taught music in the schoolhouse her stepfather had raised from ruin. They never said the word miracle, but sometimes when the wind blew just right and the train whistle echoed through the plains, Josie would step outside, breathe deep, and whisper, "I remember the snow, and I remember who I pulled from it." He would take her hand, still warm after all these years, and together they would stay. When the railway's silver line finally reached the edge of their land, it didn't cut through like a scar. It curved, gentle and deliberate, as if asking permission before laying itself down. The station was built just beyond the rise, where Josie's husband used to take the children to watch the sunrise. Daniel chose the spot himself. They named the station Thatcher's Rest. The name was her idea. "You can't name it after me," she said one morning, elbow deep in bread dough. Daniel looked up from his papers. "Why not?" "Because I didn't build a railway." "No," he said. "You built something more permanent." The town bloomed around the station, not all at once, but with purpose, slowly, like people planting roots instead of flags. A butcher came from Kansas, said he was tired of chasing towns that vanished in dust. A school teacher's sister brought her own children and a cart of books. They built a lending library out of an old barn, and Josie's daughter Maggie became its first caretaker. People kept coming. Some had heard about the town where a rail magnate had settled down in a widow's cabin and built with his hands instead of his title. Others just needed some place where no one asked why they were starting over. Thatcher's Rest gave them both. Josie still kept the cabin, even when Daniel built a proper house just uphill With glass windows and a porch wide enough for 3 rocking chairs, she spent most mornings in the cabin kitchen. The stove was temperamental, the roof still leaked. But it smelled like her children's laughter and her first years with Daniel. It was where he'd bled into the floor, where she'd found her strength, where a life had begun again. They never tore it down, they built around it. They turned the field beside it into a garden. Daniel planted pear trees along the edge. Said he'd read once that they bloom best near old wood. Josie sat on the front step one summer evening, watching Isaac play his fiddle while the neighbor boys danced barefoot in the dust. She felt Daniel's arm settle behind her shoulders. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. They'd long since moved beyond needing to fill silence with sound. The train whistle blew in the distance, low and long. Children paused their dancing. Somewhere in town, a lantern flickered on. Daniel murmured, "You hear that? I hear peace." Years later, when Daniel passed in his sleep, Josie was the one who found him. One hand over his chest, his glasses still perched on the bridge of his nose. His last entry in the ledger read, "Ordered nails, sent payment to the mill." Josie smiled at me today, longer than usual. That's enough to build anything. They buried him beneath the cottonwoods he'd planted. His sons lowered him into the earth, his daughters humming a hymn Josie didn't know, but felt like something from home. There was no monument, just a bench, just a plaque that read, "He stayed, he built, he loved." Josie didn't cry at the graveside. She cried weeks later when the first frost came and she caught herself reaching for his coat to patch the elbow. She sat with it in her lap for an hour before she folded it tight and placed it in the bottom drawer beneath her father's Bible and Isaac's baby shoes. That winter was quiet, but not lonely. Maggie brought soup every Sunday. The station master stopped by with news from the South. Isaac wrote her songs on paper and left them on the sill like gifts. And one day, a young couple knocked on her door, muddy and breathless, asking if there was land to build on. Josie gave them tea, then gave them Daniel's field. "This land knows how to welcome people," she said. "You just have to let it." They named their first child Thatcher. Years turned again. The station grew. The post office expanded. The schoolhouse took in children from 10 miles out. And always someone told the story of the woman who dragged a frozen man from a snowstorm and stitched him back together. When Josie's time came, it came slow. She spent her last weeks on the porch of the cabin, wrapped in quilts, watching the town breathe. The garden rustled in the wind. A child laughed in the distance. The rails gleamed silver in the sun. She didn't write a final letter. She didn't speak a final speech. But the night before she passed, she whispered to Maggie, "I thought I'd never live past grief, but then someone gave me a reason to plant again." They buried her beside Daniel. The plaque beneath hers read, "She opened the door," and he walked in. Together they stayed. Together they built the rest. And Thatcher's rest kept going. The trains still came. The children still ran barefoot through the garden. And when people asked how the town began, someone always pointed to the cabin and said, "With a storm, and a woman who refused to let a man die alone." In the years after Josie's death, the cabin became more than history. It became sacred. People came to it like they came to the cottonwood grove, quietly, reverently, without needing explanation. Some left flowers, some left letters. Some simply touched the doorframe, fingertips grazing the wood as if trying to feel the pulse that once beat inside. Because in a way, it still did. Maggie preserved the cabin exactly as her mother had left it. The rocker by the hearth, the cracked blue bowl on the shelf, the worn patch of rug where Isaac had first taken his steps. She opened it once a month, let school children walk through with wide eyes and respectful hands, told them the story, how it began with snow and silence and a man who hadn't expected to survive. The children asked the same questions every time. Was he really rich? He was. Did he really stay? Maggie always smiled. He did. Isaac played his fiddle on the porch each Sunday, even when arthritis curled his fingers, even when the breeze cut sharp and dry across the plains. People came from all corners of the township to listen. Some brought blankets, some brought bread, all brought silence. In Thatcher's Rest, music wasn't performance. It was remembrance. It was prayer. And when Isaac finally laid down his bow for the last time, his granddaughter took it up. Her name was Ada, and her playing sounded like wind through tall grass, wistful, searching, full of memory. Ada became the new steward of the cabin. She didn't live there, but she kept it alive. She repainted the porch rail when the sun stripped it raw, resealed the windows before frost set in. She memorized the story, not from books, but from listening, night after night, to her father, her aunt, the neighbors, the journals tucked in the reading room of the library that had once been the general store. She added her own words one evening, scribbled in the margin of Josie's last ledger entry. Some people save you once. Some people keep saving you every day after. She did both. Thatcher's Rest flourished. Its roots deepened. A second rail line came through, but the town refused to modernize just for the sake of speed. They kept the original station, the benches Daniel had carved. The slow approach that made passengers pause before stepping off the train made them wonder if time moved differently here. It did. There were still storms, still hard winters and failed crops and nights where the sky cracked open with lightning and grief. But there was also rebuilding, again and again, always. A woman named Grace opened a bakery across from the schoolhouse. She wore her sorrow like armor, but baked loaves that tasted like joy. A widower named Thomas came from the southern hills with nothing but a dog and a memory he couldn't outrun. He built houses for others until someone finally built one for him. Every new addition to the town was done with care, and every person who stayed added a stone to the garden wall behind the cabin, a small round rock with their name carved in it, their year of arrival, their reason, if they chose to give it. Some just said, lost, then found. Ada kept the records, and she created the map of staying, a hand-drawn chart that stretched across a wall in the schoolhouse, marking each family who'd made Thatcher's Rest home. Each act of building, each hand extended, each harvest shared. The map was filled with dotted lines, not boundaries, but threads, trails between people, paths between kindnesses. One boy asked why there were no fences on the map. Ada answered, because nothing here needs dividing. When the 75th anniversary of the railway's arrival came, they held a celebration, not with fireworks or grand speeches, just with candles placed in the windows of every home. One by one, they lit up the hills, a quiet glow stretching across the dark, like the whole town breathing together. Ada stood beneath the cottonwoods that night, a lantern in her hand, and whispered to the trees, "You were right to stay." Years passed again. Children became parents. Keepers passed their duties on. The cabin stood through it all, through lightning and drought, through snow piled high enough to bury fence posts, through joy so wide it filled the streets. Eventually, Ada wrote the final entry in the last ledger Josie had ever touched. She sat by the fire, the quilt Josie had stitched drawn over her lap, and wrote, "There are more people now, more noise, more color, more song. But still we sit on this porch. Still we walk the same path. Still we say your names when the wind rises. You opened the door, Josie. You gave him a second chance. And he gave us a place that remembers. We haven't forgotten. We never will." When she closed the ledger, she stood, lit one last candle, and placed it on the cabin's windowsill. Its light glowed long into the night, and beyond it, in every house and heart and hand that stayed, the story lived on. Years later, when Thatcher's Rest celebrated its centennial, the entire town gathered in the field where Daniel Everett had once helped raise the first schoolhouse. It was midsummer, sun-warm, wind-still, the kind of evening that felt suspended in honey. The trees along the edge of the property cast long shadows, and the cottonwoods whispered like old friends. No one could remember the last time it hadn't rained on a celebration, but this year the sky held soft and bright, as if the past itself were holding its breath. There was no stage, no formal seating, just quilts laid out in the grass, pies lined up on trestle tables, and the smell of baked bread, lilac, and smoke. At the center of it all stood the cabin, a little older, its wood softer with age, its hinges slower but still upright, still standing, still opening its door. People came from all over, descendants of those first families, railway historians, wanderers who'd once passed through for a week and never left. Some came out of curiosity, some came out of debt, some came just to see if the stories were true. They were. The current keeper, a young man named Eli, whose hands bore the same shape as Daniel's and whose voice had the same steadiness Josie once carried into every room, stood on the porch of the cabin, holding the newest journal. The front page had only one sentence so far: "We are still here." He wore a clean linen shirt, had brushed his hair, but he looked like himself. He didn't clear his throat or wait for silence. He just spoke. "They didn't mean to found a town," he said. "They meant to survive a storm." Heads nodded. No one blinked. "Josie didn't want to be a hero. She wanted her children to be warm." He turned a page. "Daniel didn't come to build anything. He came to die somewhere quiet." He looked up. "And then they both did something unremarkable. They chose not to give up." A breeze stirred the grass. Eli smiled. "And that's what built Thatcher's Rest. Not grand plans, not rail or timber or maps, just two people who looked at each other in the middle of a storm and said, 'Let's keep going.'" There was no applause, just stillness. Then someone began to hum, softly. It was the hymn Josie had once sung under her breath when she believed no one was listening. Others joined in. By the end of the verse, the whole town was singing, not loud, not proud, just together, like always. That night, after the lanterns were snuffed and the pies reduced to crumbs, and the laughter folded itself into memory, Eli sat on the porch with the journal open in his lap. The candle beside him burned low. The stars stretched far. He wrote, 100 years ago, a woman dragged a man through her door and chose mercy. He woke, and instead of leaving, he stayed. He listened. He built. He gave. She didn't ask for a legacy, but she has one. We have her hands in ours every time we rebuild a fence, welcome a stranger, carry soup across the road. We have his voice in our silence. Their story was never about one moment. It was about every moment after. He paused, listened. In the dark, a train whistle cried out, distant, but close enough to remind them all that the line still ran, that someone was always arriving, that someone would always find this place. Eli turned to the final page of the journal, wrote, "If you've just arrived, you are part of it now. If you've been here forever, you always have been. If you are wondering whether you're welcome, yes. If you are wondering whether you belong, yes. If you are wondering whether this place is real." He looked up at the cabin, at the field, at the people sleeping peacefully in the houses Daniel had helped build, at the stars. It is. Then he closed the book, blew out the candle, and let the story rest for the night. It would begin again in the morning. It always did, because someone stayed and someone always would. The next morning, the sun broke over Thatcher's Rest in slow golden streaks, painting the fields in light that shimmered on dew and caught the edges of old fences like fire. It touched the cabin first, always the cabin, and warmed the porch where Eli still sat, head tilted back, eyes closed, journal in his lap. The candle had long since burned out. The air smelled like wheat and honeysuckle. Inside, the stove ticked as it cooled. A rooster called from somewhere near the barn. Someone laughed. Someone else swept. Eli stirred, stretched, then opened the journal once more. He wrote, "This morning feels like a beginning again, like it did for her, for him, for everyone who's ever stepped across this threshold and felt the breath return to their lungs." He paused, then added, "It's humbling to hold the pen, but it's not heavy, because I'm not writing alone." Behind him, the door creaked open. Marin stood there. She'd arrived just before the centennial, a girl with wide eyes and a letter from a grandmother she'd never known, whose final wish was, "If you get lost, find Thatcher's rest." She'd spent the last 2 weeks helping Ruth's descendant harvest corn, reading from the journals, brushing dust off every page with fingers reverent as prayer. "Morning," she said softly. Eli turned, smiled. "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep." He scooted aside, patted the bench. She sat beside him, knees tucked close. "I finished reading the ones from Josie's years," she said. "All of them." "What did you think?" She was tired. Eli nodded. She was. "But she never stopped," Marin whispered. "No, she didn't." They sat in silence for a long while, watching the town wake. Smoke curled from chimneys. Boots echoed on packed dirt. A child yelled something about eggs. Then Marin asked, "How do you know when it's your turn to write?" Eli looked at her, not surprised. "You already know," he said. She nodded slowly, swallowed. "I don't know if I'll say it right." "You don't have to." He stood, placed the journal in her hands. "Just tell the truth." She looked down at the cover, fingers tracing the soft leather, then opened to the next blank page. The ink trembled at first, then steadied. "I didn't know what I was looking for until I found this porch, this bench, this town. I've been hungry in ways I didn't have words for, and here someone handed me a biscuit before they asked my name. That's when I knew. This place doesn't wait for proof of worth. It gives you the benefit of the doubt. It gives you a warm plate and a second chance. And if you stay long enough, it teaches you to give that to others." She set the pen down, exhaled. Eli smiled. "You're the keeper now." Her eyes widened. "What if I don't know how?" "You'll learn," he said, "and you won't be alone." And she wasn't. She was never alone, because every page she wrote joined the chorus of all the pages before, because every word was another candle lit in the windowsill, because the porch would never be empty for long, because someone was always coming down that old dirt road, looking for a reason to believe in goodness again. And when they arrived dusty and hesitant and unsure, Marin would rise, open the door, and say, "You're right on time." The journal would be open, the ink ready, the story waiting, always waiting. Because they had stayed, because they had written, because they had built a place that didn't end. And it never would. And long after Marin's hair turned silver, long after the porch steps had been replaced 3 more times, the town beyond the field grew until it pressed softly at the edges of what had once been just a cabin, a barn, a patch of earth and firelight. But the heart of it never changed. The story held. The journals filled shelf after shelf in the reading room, now a sunlit space with tall windows and worn chairs where anyone could sit and listen to the voices of those who'd come before. Some of the older books were kept under glass, open to favorite pages, with notes in the margins, pressed flowers between entries, smudged ink that carried the touch of hands long buried beneath cottonwood roots. People came just to read. Some came just to write. Every week there was someone new, a woman from the north with a dog and a scar and a silence like stone, a boy who never said his last name, but who fixed the porch roof without being asked, a man who wept when he heard the wind through the orchard because it sounded like a lullaby his mother used to sing. They came. They stayed. Not all forever, but long enough to leave something behind. Marin taught them gently, like she'd been taught. She taught them to start small. how to notice the way bread rises, how to sweep corners, not just paths, how to write what hurts without apology, and what heals without disguise. One day a little girl asked her, "Why do we write so much?" Marin set aside the basket of onions she'd been peeling and said, "Because if we don't, people forget how long love can last." The girl thought about that, then picked up a pen. By the time Marin was too old to bend easily, the others had learned to listen for her voice even when she wasn't in the room. They'd say, "Marin wouldn't let us waste good flour," or "Marin would have told you to walk it off, but only after feeding you stew." When she passed, peacefully, in her chair by the window, with the last journal still open on her lap, the town slowed. Not stopped, just slowed, and they lit candles in every window. They placed quilts on the porch railing. They brought flowers to the cabin door, each stem tied with ribbon, some old, some new. And no one spoke loud. They didn't need to, because the journals spoke for them. Because her words were still warm on the page. Her final entry was short, clear, unmistakably hers. The porch is swept. The tea is warm. The new girl knows how to mend a torn hem and make strangers feel safe. The story continues. I was lucky to carry it this far. She signed it simply, M. The town buried her beside the cottonwood near Cora and Daniel and Josie and the rest. The marker was plain, the bench nearby newly sanded. There was no eulogy, only the journals. And the next day, when the sun rose soft and pink and the train came through at 7:30, a young woman with a rucksack stepped off the last car and looked around. She looked tired. She looked unsure. She asked the man at the platform, "Is this Thatcher's Rest?" He nodded. "You looking for someone?" She hesitated and then said, "I think I'm looking for something to believe in." The man pointed down the road. "You'll find it," he said. "There's a cabin just past the bend. They're always expecting someone." She walked. She found the porch. She knocked. And someone opened the door, smiled, said, "You're right on time." The journal was already open, a new page waiting, and the story never stopped. That woman's name was Ruthie. She had come from nowhere in particular, carried nothing but a rucksack, and wore the kind of shoes that had been resoled more times than anyone had the heart to count. Her hands were small, but they looked like they knew how to carry weight. She stepped through the door of the old cabin turned heart of the town and blinked into the amber light like she didn't quite believe it was real. Someone handed her a mug of tea. No one asked why she'd come. She wasn't ready to say. But they showed her the garden, the shelves, the journal waiting by the hearth, with a bookmark stitched from a strip of Maggie's apron. She was told she could write when she wanted, or not, that she could help in the kitchen or out by the fence line, or not. That staying didn't come with conditions, only choices. And slowly Ruthie made them. She started in the garden, picking weeds with methodical fingers. She moved to the breadroom, where she learned to knead in silence, her hands sinking into dough like it was soil. Then, one morning after the first frost, she found herself sitting on the bench by the cottonwood, watching the sky roll out blue above the rooftops. The journal was in her lap, the pen in her hand. And before she could second-guess it, she began to write. "I thought I was just passing through. I always think that. I have walked so many roads waiting for the one that tells me to stop walking. I think this is it, not because it's easy, but because it's quiet, because it doesn't ask me to prove anything, because it gave me bread and didn't ask for my name first." She paused, then wrote, "I've never stayed anywhere, not until now." That entry marked the beginning of her chapters in the story. She never announced herself as a keeper, but she became one. She taught the younger ones how to listen, not just to the stories in the journals, but to the pauses between words when someone wasn't sure how to ask for help. She fixed what was broken. She repaired the window latch that always caught in the spring. She sang while she stirred soup low and off-key, but warm. And in time, people began turning to her without thinking. They'd say, Ask Ruthie, the way they once said. Ask Marin. And before that, ask Ada. And before that, ask June. She wore the same coat every winter, repaired the cuffs with patches from the quilting basket. She carried a notebook in her apron, tucked beside a pair of sewing scissors and a strip of ribbon she'd never explained. And she kept writing. One entry from a quiet night in February read, "A woman came tonight with a boy who won't speak. She didn't say much, just sat by the fire and cried into her tea. The boy watched the flame like he was waiting for something to leap out. I handed him a journal, didn't say a word. He opened it, that was enough. And another, from a spring day that smelled of wildflowers and sawdust. They planted a new bench near the cottonwood. Someone carved the word 'again' into the back rail. I don't know who, I don't need to know. It feels right. This place is full of agains, full of new tries, full of do-overs that don't ask what you did the first time. Ruthie lived simply. She asked for little. She gave much. And when her hair turned white and her hands began to shake, she let someone else light the stove, let someone else lift the flour sacks. But she still wrote, every night, by lantern, by memory, by heart. Her final entry came in the first days of another fall. The leaves turned early this year. The young ones danced beneath them like fire wasn't something to fear. I remember being afraid of everything. Now I just want one more season of bread and sunlight. But if I don't get it, I'll still call this a good life. Not because it was perfect, because it let me belong. She placed the journal on the shelf. She folded her apron. She sat by the window where the wind moved softly through the seams. And in her sleep she stayed. They buried her beside the others. The stone was simple. Ruthie, she thought she'd pass through. She didn't. And the next morning the sun rose like it always did. The porch door swung open, and someone, new, uncertain, half ready to hope again, stepped over the threshold and was met with the same words spoken for over a century. You're right on time. The journal lay open, the ink still fresh, the story ready, and it would go on. Because it always had. Because someone always stayed. The next one came in winter. She arrived just after sundown, boots caked with frozen mud, fingers raw around the straps of a threadbare satchel. Her name was Elia. She didn't offer it at first. She only stood there on the edge of the porch in the blue-gray dusk, staring at the sliver of warm light leaking through the window pane. Inside, no one moved quickly. They didn't run to greet her or shout her welcome. They simply opened the door. A man named Jonah handed her a cup of broth. A girl named Tess brought her socks that didn't match. And someone, no one remembered who, later said, "There's a place by the fire if you want it." Elia sat. She didn't speak. Not that night, not the next. But she stayed. She helped wash dishes on the third morning, shoveled snow in the silence between sun and wind, picked up the journals and turned their pages slowly, like they were made of something softer than paper. When someone passed her a pencil and pointed to a blank book left open on the table, she stared for a long time before writing, "I don't know how to be anything but cold, but maybe this place remembers warmth better than I do." She didn't sign it. She didn't need to. Everyone knew. Elia took to the work the way trees take to wind, flexing without breaking. She patched clothes, carried water, listened without interrupting. And when a boy named Harlan arrived with a bruised rib and a story that wouldn't come out of his mouth, she sat next to him by the window every night until he finally whispered, "I didn't mean to run." She answered, "We don't keep score, just breath." He stayed. So did she. One day Tess brought her an old journal with a torn spine and asked if she'd help mend it. Elia did, slowly, carefully. When she was done, she wrote in the back cover, "This book saw someone through something. That makes it holy." The days blurred into each other, in the way good days do, full of wood smoke and stew, of mended hinges and quiet lullabies, hummed without melody. Elia became part of it, One breath in a long line of breathing, one hand stirring the same soup others had stirred for 100 years. Eventually, she started writing more. One entry read, "I still think about the silence that lived in my chest before this place. It's not gone, but now it has neighbors, laughter, footsteps, a name whispered softly through a doorframe. I don't always know what I'm doing, but I know how to stay." And I think that's enough. When spring came, she planted daffodils along the edge of the path. No one asked her to. She just wanted something bright where the world bent low. On the anniversary of Ruthie's passing, Elia stood beneath the cottonwood and read aloud from the journals. Her voice was steady, low. She read, "They thought they were passing through. They weren't. This place doesn't let go once it's held you." Later that night she sat alone on the bench, the journal open beside her, a candle flickering on the sill. She picked up the pen, wrote, "Maybe the story doesn't need heroes. Maybe it just needs someone to sweep the steps and keep the tea hot. I can do that. I'll do that." The next morning, Jonah passed her the keeper's ribbon, tied it gently around her wrist. "You're it now," he said. Elia looked at him. "What if I get it wrong?" "You won't." "But what if—" He smiled. "Then we'll keep writing until you get it right." So she kept writing. And someone else came and stayed. And the story grew, because the porch was still open, because the bread was still warm, because the journals still had pages. And always, always, because someone stayed. Years later, Elia was known as the one who knew how to light a fire, so it caught on the first strike, no matter how wet the wood or cold the wind. She taught the children to find kindling in the unlikeliest places, beneath the porch, under the heavy edges of thawing snow, tucked in the elbows of the oldest trees. "It's not about the flame," she told them. "It's about the tending." They wrote that down. By then, the journals filled 2 walls of the reading room. New ones were added in all shapes and bindings, some leather, some linen, one made from stitched bark and thread. The shelves bent slightly under their weight, but no one moved them. They liked the lean. It felt human. The town, too, leaned gently now, toward the train line, toward the river, toward the road that brought strangers and kept turning them into neighbors. Thatcher's rest had grown, but not wide. It grew deep. There were more homes, more children, more trees planted in the memory of someone who once made soup that could fix any kind of ache. The garden had 3 generations of rosemary now. One woman swore it whispered when the wind came through. Elia stayed through all of it. She weathered the loss of Jonah, quiet and sudden, gone between one heartbeat and the next. She sat alone at the fire for a long time after, not speaking, not writing, until one morning she picked up the journal and simply wrote, "He stayed. Now I must." That entry became a turning point. New keepers rose. A girl named Lo, who had once been found at the rail station with a bruise on her cheek and no shoes. A boy named Elias, who never liked to speak but carved memories into wood so well they were hung on the walls like scripture. A woman named Beth, who brought stories from the coast and bread that made even grief quiet for a while. They took over what Elia could no longer lift. But she still tended the garden, the words, the first pages of every new journal. She taught the younger keepers to date their entries, but not to rush the ink. "Let it sit," she said, "let it settle like rain." Sometimes she would sit with a cup of tea by the cabin window and read from the early volumes, not aloud, just to remember how it started. She would find Cora's shaky lines, speaking of silence and survival, Daniel's crisp hand charting rainfall and kindness, Josie's margin notes about Maggie's stubbornness and Isaac's laughter. She would trace her fingers over Ruthie's quiet truths, Marin's steady strength, Claire's open door, and she would smile, a soft thing, like breath. Then she would pick up her own pen and write, "Still here." Elia passed on a Tuesday. The wind was soft. The sun stayed just long enough. She was in her chair beside the hearth, the last journal open to a blank page. Her glasses lay folded atop it. Her tea had gone cold. There was no letter, just one small note in the margin of the previous day's entry. It read, "If someone's reading this, then it's your turn. Don't worry, the story already knows how to carry you." They buried her beside Jonah, beneath a plum tree that bloomed early every year. The stones said only, "Eliah." She tended the flame. And the next morning, as the town rose and the sky softened, Lo picked up the pen. She opened a new journal, traced her fingers over the spine, and on the first page wrote, "It is our turn now. We do not take it lightly. We do not take it alone." And then she stepped outside, swept the porch, lit the fire, watched the road, waiting, always waiting, because someone would come. And the door would be open, and the tea would be warm, and the pages would be blank, just waiting for the next name, the next breath, the next staying, and the story, as it always did, would begin again. A boy arrived the next day. He couldn't have been more than 15, skin like driftwood, hair long and tangled, eyes hollow in the way that comes from too many nights without sleep and too many roads without endings. He walked with a limp, not fresh, but the kind that had worn into his bones. He said nothing when he stepped onto the porch, just stood, staring at the weather-worn planks and the steam curling from the chimney. Lo saw him from the garden. She didn't rush. She brushed the dirt from her hands, wiped her palms on her apron, and met him at the steps. "You hungry?" He nodded. She stepped aside. He walked through the door. She didn't ask his name. She gave him a bowl of stew and a slice of bread, and waited. It wasn't until nightfall that he spoke, voice barely above the crackle of the hearth. "Is it true?" he asked. Lo looked up from the journal she was writing in. "Is what true? That this place doesn't forget you. That once you're here, it stays with you, even if you leave." She set her pen down, closed the book gently. "We don't promise forever," she said. "We promise right now. We promise bread and quiet and a place to sit while you remember how to breathe." He nodded. His fingers tightened around the spoon. His eyes filled, though no tears fell. She said, "There's a bed in the back, clean blankets. You can stay as long as you need." He stayed. He helped repair the shed after a spring wind tore its roof loose. He cleaned the gutters. He fed the chickens at dawn without being told. He was quiet, always, but not empty. The others called him Finch. No one knew why. He didn't correct them. And one day, Lo found a page in the newest journal. No name at the bottom, just a line, scribbled in a slanted, careful hand. "I was never good at staying. But this place didn't ask me to be good. It asked me to try." She wrote beneath it, "Trying is enough." Finch didn't stay forever. After 3 seasons, after the snow returned and melted again, he left. Left a note on the bench. Left his boots by the door. Left his name finally carved gently into the underside of a floorboard with a penknife. But he sent letters every year. The first read, "I'm still trying. I built a table like the one in the cabin. I make soup on Sundays. I planted 2 plum trees." The second, "There's someone here now who needed to rest. I gave them your stew recipe. They smiled. I think they'll stay for a while." The third, "I understand now. You weren't just keeping records. You were building a map, and I'm still walking it." By then the journals took up 3 walls. Children were taught their history, not from textbooks, but from ink-stained stories of bread and blizzards and benches and kindness. Every keeper since Cora was remembered, their handwriting, their rhythms, their hesitations and hopes. And every new arrival added something, a recipe, a lullaby, a poem, a line of truth that would echo for generations, like the boy with the boots too big who wrote, "I came here to disappear. You made me visible," or the girl who lost her mother and found her voice beside the fire. "My grief had nowhere to go. You gave it a room, a window, a name." Or the man who never said why he wept, but who left behind the smoothest carved spoon anyone had ever held, and a note folded beneath it. Some things don't need telling to be understood. The porch never stayed empty long. There was always someone arriving, always someone sweeping, always someone turning the next page, pen in hand, heart in throat, knowing this place would not erase their pain, but would hold it gently. And so the story went on, because Lo taught the next keeper, and the next, and everyone after whispered the same vow, not loud, not formal, just steady: I will stay, and I will make room for whoever needs to stay next. And there was always room, always warmth, always pages left to write, because love had made a home of this place, because time had honored the first act of mercy with 1,000 small echoes, because the storm that nearly ended one life had in the end saved them all, because someone had stayed, and someone always would. One spring morning, a child was born beneath the cottonwood. The midwife said it happened faster than any she'd seen. No cries until the last push, no hesitation, just a quiet labor, steady and certain, as if the child already knew where they were, as if she'd been waiting for the right season, the right wind, the right porch to take her first breath. They named her Mercy. Her mother, Wren, had arrived the year before with her past locked behind her teeth and a baby curled beneath her ribs. She never said where she came from, and no one asked. She chopped firewood until her hands bled. She knit blankets in the dark. She helped rebuild the fence around the orchard and added her own story to the wall of carved names in the cabin's eaves. After the birth, Wren sat on the porch wrapped in wool, Mercy at her breast, and stared out at the pale green horizon with tears that didn't fall. Lo brought her tea, sat beside her, didn't say a word. Wren said, I didn't think I could belong anywhere. Lo said, You already do. That night, Mercy's name was written in the newest journal. The page read, She came in the season of thaw. She came like light through frost. She came where no one asked her to be more than herself. And that is the whole of what we give her, a life where being is enough. They gave her a quilt made of pieces from every family who had lived there, old cloth, new stitches, one square from Daniel's coat, another from Josie's apron, a corner from Marin's shawl. The children called it the legacy blanket. Mercy grew beneath its warmth. She crawled across the cabin floor before she could walk, learned to speak by repeating lines from the journals. She knew the names of every keeper by heart before she turned 5. She played beneath the cottonwood, climbed its thick arms, whispered secrets into the knots of its bark, and waited, with the patience only children know, for it to whisper back. And it always did. By the time she was 12, she was reading aloud every evening. Her voice clear, her cadence natural, like the story belonged in her mouth, which it did. One night she read a passage from Ilia's time and stopped halfway through. I think she was scared, Mercy said softly. Lo nodded. We all are, sometimes. But she wrote anyway. That's what courage looks like. That summer, Mercy asked to learn to bind a book. She stitched her first cover by hand, inked the lines on every page, and titled it with a single word, Here. Her first entry was simple. I was born in a place made of bread and wood smoke, and the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own heart beating. I don't know the world beyond this. I only know this room, this land, this breath. But it is enough. And I think that's what love really is. She never left, not for long. She traveled once when she was 17, took the train east with a basket of letters and a list of names, people who'd passed through Thatcher's Rest and left their stories behind like footprints. She visited them, sat in kitchens and gardens and train stations, read them their old journal entries, asked what they remembered. Most cried, some laughed. All said the same thing. I didn't know I mattered that much. When she returned, she laid her satchel on the table and said, They remember. And Lo said, so do we. When Lo passed, peacefully, as keepers often did, with the journal still open on her lap and bread rising in the stove, Mercy sat in the chair beside her all night, wrote nothing, said nothing, just held her hand until it cooled. In the morning, she opened a new journal, inked the date, then wrote, I thought I had time to ask her what came next, but maybe I already knew. Maybe it's not about knowing. Maybe it's about watching and listening and doing the next right thing. So I will, for her, for me, for whoever walks through the gate next. And they did walk through. They always did. A man with a wooden leg who played the harmonica for chickens. A girl named Echo who wrote poems in the dirt with a stick and didn't speak until Mercy handed her a book and said, you don't need a voice to have one. A pair of twins who showed up with 2 goats, a broken wagon, and a promise never to be separated again. Mercy welcomed them all, taught them to plant, to write, to stay. And when she grew old, when her hands began to shake and her voice softened like worn linen, she called the youngest girl to her side. A child named Nella, who had once been found curled behind the woodshed during a storm and hadn't stopped shaking for days. Mercy handed her the latest journal. This is yours now, she said. Nella's lip trembled. I don't know how. You will, Mercy said. We all do, one word at a time. And that night Nella sat by the fire, opened to the first page, and wrote, Mercy said the story doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be true. So here is mine. I was cold. They made me warm. I was scared. They didn't ask why. I was alone. They stayed. And outside, beneath the stars, the cottonwood shifted in the wind. The lantern flickered. The road waited. The story turned another page. And someone stayed. And then, one evening, so quietly no one noticed at first, the stars aligned above Thatcher's Rest in a way that hadn't happened in 112 years. The oldest among them remembered the stories, how on a night like this, long before the town had a name, Josie had wrapped a dying man in a quilt and told the storm it could howl, but it would not have him. How Daniel Everett had whispered forgiveness into the walls of the cabin and built a life instead of an empire. How staying had once been a kind of rebellion and a kind of salvation. Nella, now 17, sat alone in the reading room, a mug of honey tea cooling beside her, the most recent journal open to the last page. She'd spent the day mending a cracked water line and baking bread with the new girl, Emmy, who still flinched at sudden sounds and carried her story in clenched fists. It had been a good day, a hard one, the kind of day that fills your chest with the ache of being alive. She picked up her pen, wrote, The sky feels old tonight, like it's remembering something. The air smells like first chances. And I keep thinking about how the people who started this place never planned to. They just made one right choice, then another. And somehow that turned into all of this. She paused, letting the ink dry, then added, Emmy asked me today if I was scared when I got here. I told her yes. She looked relieved. We didn't say anything else, but I think that was the whole conversation. I think sometimes healing is just sitting next to someone until they believe they can stay. The wind moved outside, gentle through the orchard. The cottonwood creaked in its sleep. Somewhere on the far edge of town, the train gave its low, familiar call. Nella stood, walked to the window, and there, coming down the road with the slowness of someone who didn't know whether they were welcome, was a woman. She had a coat 2 sizes too large, a bag slung over one shoulder, and a way of walking that said she hadn't rested in a very long time. Nella didn't hesitate. She lit the porch lantern, opened the front door, stepped out into the cool dark. The woman stopped 10 paces away, shadows on her face, uncertainty in her eyes. Nella said, "Are you hungry?" The woman blinked. "I think so. We have stew and tea and a fire." Silence, then soft as snow. "Can I come in?" Nella smiled. Of course. And she held the door open, because someone had once held it open for her, because someone had always held it open. Inside, the fire waited. The journals waited. The story waited. A new page. A warm hand. A quiet beginning. And just like that, as it had again and again for over a century, the world tilted softly on its axis. And the story began again. Because someone had arrived, and someone had stayed, and someone always would. And some years later, long after Nella had taught 3 more keepers how to light the stove before dawn, how to sweep not just the porch but the spaces between people's words, an old man came down the road with nothing but a walking stick and a folded handkerchief in his coat pocket. He walked with the slow purpose of someone who had once run too fast, too far. His coat was patched in 3 places. His shoes were soft at the heel. He paused at the gate, looked at the lantern, the porch, the bench, the tree. Then he stepped onto the porch like he'd been called there by name. Inside, a boy of 12, Reed, the newest to have joined the household after a windstorm leveled his family's barn 2 towns over, stood near the door, broom in hand. The old man raised his eyebrows. Is this the place?" Reed nodded. "It is. Is there bread?" "Still warm." "Is there room?" "There always is." That night the old man sat by the fire and didn't say much. He smiled at the dog. He took off his shoes. He listened as the younger ones read from the journals, trading paragraphs like lanterns passed hand to hand. When Nella sat beside him and offered him the most recent volume, he touched it like it was something sacred. "I never stayed anywhere," he said. "You are now," she replied. He nodded. "Do I need to write?" "You don't have to," she said. "But if you want to, the page is ready." And he did. His handwriting was sharp, slanted, deliberate. "I've run long enough. I've said goodbye too many times. I thought rest was for other people, the ones who built, who stayed, who mattered. But tonight someone handed me bread before they asked me anything, and that's the closest I've ever come to being forgiven." He signed it simply, M. That initial was added to the list carved along the hallway wall, the list that began with Cora and ended only when another hand took up the pen. Reed would take it next. Everyone knew. He watched people like they were stories. He wrote little scraps of dialogue in the margins of the ledgers. He once stayed up all night to write a single sentence. "I think staying is a kind of love. Not loud, not sharp, just the kind that keeps showing up." And so, when Nella grew too tired to lead the morning baking, too tired to write more than a few words each night, Reed took over. He was 15 in his first entry. "Today, I handed a cup of tea to a man who didn't believe he deserved it. And he cried. Not because it was hot, not because it was sweet, because someone saw him and still gave him something warm." In time, Reed's journals filled just like all the others, with weather notes, with names, with music, with poetry, with silence written down like breath. And on the day Nella passed quietly, without ceremony, her last breath drawn beneath the cottonwood's shadow, Reed stood beside her chair, picked up the book she had left open, and wrote the words she had taught him. She stayed. She taught us how. "We will keep going, 1 page at a time." He folded the corner of the page, closed the journal, and stepped out onto the porch. Down the road, a girl was coming. She looked tired. She looked scared. She looked like she'd never been told she could stay. Reed opened the door before she reached the steps. "You're right on time," he said. And the story, soft as always, bloomed again. And that girl, her name was Fern, stumbled up the steps with wind-burned cheeks and a crumpled paper in her pocket. She hadn't meant to come here. She'd been walking west with no real destination, following fence lines and half-remembered stories told by someone long gone. But when she saw the cabin with its crooked porch and the lantern in the window, something inside her that had been coiled too tight for too long began to loosen. Reed handed her a blanket before she asked. Fern didn't cry. Not yet. She just sat by the fire with her hands outstretched and said, "It smells like someone cares." Someone passed her a mug. Someone else set bread beside her. And then no one asked anything more of her that night. The next morning she was gone from her bed. But the broom had been used, the dishwater dumped, a journal page turned down in a corner. She came back in through the back door just before breakfast, hair wet from creek water, cheeks pink, a handful of wildflowers in her fist. "For the table," she said. She stayed, and she stitched the elbow of Reed's jacket with thread she had saved in her boot. She fixed the hinge on the pantry. She didn't say much, but after a week she opened a journal, turned to the first clean page, and wrote, "I've spent so much time preparing to be left that I forgot how to recognize staying. I think this place might be teaching me again. The floors creak like they're glad you walked across them. The people don't ask for explanations. The sky here is bigger than my fear." She signed it finally. Fern. Reed found the entry the next day. He didn't say anything, just folded a daisy inside the page and returned the book to its shelf. Seasons passed. Fern stayed through the first frost, through the freeze that broke 2 water lines and kept them up 3 nights in a row, through the spring thaw that turned the path to soup and made everyone walk barefoot for 3 days. She planted rosemary by the window, started a second recipe journal, sang when she chopped wood. She built shelves in the tool shed and organized the nails by size. When a child scraped their knee, she was the one who knelt beside them and said, "It's okay, it hurts, but you're still here, and that means you get to keep going." Everyone started saying that. You get to keep going. It became a kind of motto, not just for bruises and burns, but for heartbreak, for silence, for beginning again. Fern wrote it above the reading room door in her neatest script. People touched it on their way in, like a benediction. And one night, Reed asked her to help him bind a new journal. His hands had started to ache, and her stitching was better. They worked beside the fire, elbow to elbow, in rhythm, no rush. When they finished, Reed wrote the first page, but instead of writing it alone, he turned to her. "You write the second line." She hesitated and then wrote, "Love begins in the ordinary." They both signed their names beneath it, not to say the book belonged to them, but to say they belonged to the book. And years later, when Fern was the one opening the door for those who arrived in rain and dust and silence, she repeated the same words she'd once been given. "You're right on time." And each time someone stayed, because that's what the story was made of. One breath, one bowl, one line, one choice, to stay, to write, to keep going, to make room. And always, always, to begin again. And in the gentle way these things always happened, Fern became the keeper without anyone naming her so. There was no ceremony, no torch passed, no long speech or ledger entry proclaiming her title. It was just that one day people stopped asking Reed what came next, and they started looking to her. She noticed it slowly, in the way Emmy left the supply notes on her table, in the way the children asked her to reread the story about the girl who planted rosemary in winter and it survived, in the way the travelers began to say thank you to her as they left, as though she had personally given them back something they thought was lost. One morning, after a snowfall that blanketed every roof in soft silence, Reed handed her the new journal. His hands were older now, his voice softer. "It's yours," he said. "You already know." Fern didn't pretend not to understand. She pressed her hand to the leather cover and whispered, "Okay." She opened it the next morning, after lighting the stove, after stirring the oats, after placing wood by the fire and shaking out the quilt that covered the bench by the window. The room was still, but not empty. Outside the porch waited. The trees stood quiet and bright. She dipped the pen in ink and began. This place has never been about rescue. It's been about recognition, about walking in through a door that stays open and realizing someone already set a place for you. You don't have to earn your welcome here. It's baked into the bread. That page became a cornerstone. Fern carried the journal everywhere. She wrote in the margins. She let others add lines. She taught the children to write what they noticed, things as simple as, "Today the butter was warm enough to spread," and "The window didn't rattle during the wind." No detail was too small to be sacred. When the power went out for 4 days, they read by candlelight and wrote about it. When a woman gave birth in the storeroom because her wagon broke an axle on the road, they wrote about that too. When the harvest was smaller than expected, but the bread still stretched enough to feed everyone, there were 3 entries in 3 different hands about the sound of laughter at the table. Fern never raised her voice. She didn't need to. People leaned in when she spoke, and when she didn't, they leaned in anyway. One evening a boy arrived with no name. He was maybe 11, maybe 12. He wouldn't say where he came from, but he took the soup with both hands and the blanket with a shiver, and sat at the edge of the room, his eyes wide. Fern knelt in front of him. "You don't have to tell me anything," she said, "but I'm going to write you into the journal." His eyes flicked up. "Why?" "So you don't disappear." She did. She wrote, "A boy came today with no name and no shoes. But he smiled when the dog rested her head on his knee. That's how I know he's staying. They called him Moss. He stayed. He whittled spoons from scrap wood and left one by every bedside. When Fern asked why, he said, 'So everyone has something to hold.'" Moss grew up in the story. By the time he was 16, he could recite the early journals from memory. He taught the younger children how to draw letters. He built a table that could seat 20 and carved the word enough into its edge. And when Fern grew older, her hair silvering, her hands slower, Moss began carrying the journal beside her. He didn't ask, he just did. One night he wrote a full page, signed it with a leaf pressed beside his name. They say the story doesn't belong to one person. I think that's true, but someone has to carry the pages until the next hands are ready. Fern carried them for me, and now I carry them with her, until someone new arrives looking for a place to be written. Fern read it in the morning and smiled. She said, "It's almost your turn." Moss said, "I know." She passed in early spring. The daffodils she'd planted years ago bloomed 2 weeks early, and the cottonwood bowed its limbs in the wind. Moss sat by her chair for hours, the journal open in his lap. He didn't write right away, not until evening. Then he wrote, "Fern tended us with silence, with softness, with steadiness. She never asked for anything but your truth. She never gave anything but warmth. If she loved you, she gave you bread and a page, and that was more than enough. This is still her story, but now it's mine too." He folded a pressed sprig of rosemary between the pages, closed the book, stood, and heard footsteps on the porch. Someone new. He opened the door, said, "You're right on time," and the story, like always, began again.